Okay, everyone, and good morning, and welcome back to day 2 of our Creative Conciliation sessions. We had a really rich and eventful day yesterday with lots of hot topics and debates being thrown around. Without further ado, I'd like to first welcome to the stage Sandra Harbin, traditional owner, Baladang Wajak country, to give us a welcome to country.
So Kaya, want you to watch out Nyunga Buja, Ngan Kurdis Jurpan to be Wangani Bununukurt. My heart is really happy to be speaking with you, and I'm really happy to be doing the Welcome to Country on behalf of the Wajak Nyunga people. You know, behind us is the beautiful Wardan, the beautiful ocean, which meets our Belia, our river, which is just to the side of us. And, you know, Kura Kura, Ngan Murta Kurkurin on the Buja. And they Yining, and they Wanganij, and they Ne Karajan. And so what I said was my ancestors, you know, our Noongar ancestors, they travelled the land, they sat on the land, and they shared knowledge. And so today, Nunukurt, everyone here will be sitting and listening also as we share knowledge, which is so important for us to learn and to continue and keep that knowledge with us. Ngan will ask for the Kwabara Wirin to Yarl Kul, and I'll ask you all to join in with me. So, Yarl Kul Kwabara Wirin. So what we've asked for is the beautiful Noongar spirits to come here and to be with us and to keep us safe while we're here on Wajak Nyunga Buja. And I always say it's important for everyone to join in and speak in the first language of this land, the Noongar language, because it's important that the Noongar spirits can hear your voices, so that when you're walking around the Buja, walking around the land, they'll have already heard your voice and know that you've called out to them, and they'll keep you safe. And Ngan will tell the Wara Wirn to Wurt Kul. So, Wara Wirn, Wurt Kul. So we've asked for the negative spirits to leave us. So Kaya, and want you to watch out Nyunga Buja, and Brudawan. I'll see you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. I'd like to also welcome our online audience. The whole session's being live streamed, so wherever you are, welcome to today's session. Another little formality is we have questions being prompted through an online app, slido.com, and you'll see it on the screen shortly behind me. You have to enter a code. It's very simple, and you can actually send us questions throughout the sessions, which will be mediated by Grant over here. We've got a really great squad of speakers this morning, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. So, beginning with Chad Crichton, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Aboriginal Arts Centre Hub of Western Australia. Chad's a Bardi and Neil man from the Kimberley region of WA. Chad's got a really rich history of appointments and extraordinary projects in Don. We look forward to hearing from you soon, Chad, about that sort of third space you talk about. Followed by that, we will have Jazz Money, who's an award-winning Wiradjuri poet, a freshwater river woman, currently based on the beautiful Gadigal land in the place now known as Sydney. Jazz has done a big, large work in collaboration with Sandra, who spoke here before, the big banners that are basically fixed to the undercroft of the Fremantle traffic bridge, and using text-based words to speak back to place. Afterwards, we'll hear from Ilona Maguire, Mumbakai artist, lead artist. Ilona is an emerging artist who's finishing her last year at Curtin University, and I think she's done extraordinary work already in the last few months, just working with the whole team and bringing in extraordinary events in conjunction with Rowan Kickett as well. Thank you, Sandra, for your words. You've also been across every project of this entire Biennale, and I think you'll speak a bit more about that later on, and how your wisdom and insights have been woven into so many projects that we have been able to witness as part of the Biennale. We'll also have Karen Jacobs. Karen is also a seminal pivot person that's been working with us since the very beginning, and she also brings a rich tradition of wisdom and ancestry to the whole program. And indeed, Rowan Kickett, that I mentioned before, Rowan's going to be speaking about his involvement in the Biennale and also reflecting with Sandra. Those two important people have been with us since the very beginning and have been guiding us and obviously helping us to do things in better ways in many ways. And indeed, your host today, Grant Revell. Grant's also on the advisory board, and Grant's been instrumental and a bit of a mentor in how we unpack and how we approach this space where we commission contemporary arts and other kind of performative-based works around place and site. So, Grant, over to you to begin the formalities.
Thanks, Tom. And thanks so much, Sandra, for the really important welcome to country. And I think we're all very much safe with the welcome, especially at this critical point of Walyalup, at the junction between the sea and the Bilia, a really important threshold, metaphorically, for today's event. I would like to start off with a little introduction of Reese, who's been doing animated sort of stories from yesterday and will do today, turning this conversation into another art form. And, Lenny Collard and I wrote an essay on these processes in the book, the Biennale book. This energy now that's happening around Biennales, which we termed ekphrastic, and that's where one art form gets energised by another. One noise gets energised by another. But it's this kind of transitional space, in between space, third space, interstitial space that's quite exciting and has been a real driver for the Biennale. How we challenge that, how we look after that, how we protocol, where we draw ethics from that, and right ways of learning and being and doing has been really important to the Biennale. Yesterday's session was pretty powerful for those who were here, listening to Clothilde Bullen, who's the new director of Indigenous programs at the Art Gallery. Fresh appointment. She took the gloves off yesterday, and it was pretty powerful in her expectations of her new appointment. And I think one of the important reminders yesterday was that the Biennale is just a program that's catching up to Noongar work and revolutionary work that's been going on for a bloody long time, over 200 years, of course. But this is not new to Noongar, of working across spaces, of collaborating, of developing relationships. It might be new to a lot of arts administrators and modulas, but I think that was a really important point, foundational point for yesterday's discussion. Chloe also talked about the frameworks that we need to get in place, and I think Chad's going to help us with that today, where institutions need to be de-institutionalised. And Chloe talked about how they should be indigenised rather than decolonised, and really important points. But these frameworks have got to go to the core. We no longer should have Indigenous directors and co-directors on charitable commissions. They are an integral part to the institution. And I would argue that they, in fact, should be an affirmative, integral part. And I think that's really exciting for Western Australia in the future, where they will be at the top. We will have biennales that are truly Indigenous-led. We're now in this in-between space where we're learning new ways and developing new partnerships and new relationships. Rowan spoke of the importance of relationships yesterday, and the way of, candidly, where Wadjulas still are misbehaving in the art space. Even after all the efforts of the Australia Council, protocols and ethics, there is this kind of, energy around policing and gatekeeping, which is almost unavoidable from an arts administration point of view. But it's not a good one. It's 2021. It'd be good to continue on with that. Now, Reece, did you want to put up this image? We're going to do that now, Nick? Oh, here it is. Reece, I don't want to steal your thunder because you can speak to it beautifully.
All right, so thanks everyone. So I think some of us were here from yesterday and maybe some new people. I suppose just for those of you that are new, I'm Reece, I'm what they call a graphic recorder. So graphic recording is simply like I talk about it as taking minutes, but with doodles. This is a bit of a summary of yesterday's capture or scribe. Just to mention, like, this is nowhere near done. Like, I'll go away today, I'll do the same sort of thing today, and then I go back and sort of format things and add the colour and all that kind of thing. But essentially, just in terms of a recap, there was a lot of conversations around that term indigenising, and sort of like what were the barriers and what were the, Rowan was mentioning, like Aboriginal arts and the contemporary arts world is quite worlds apart, and sort of what are the barriers in why that is to the lack of understanding on the left there, and sort of need that need for more educated Indigenous voices in that space. There's a lot of conversations about Aboriginal leadership and Aboriginal-led discussions and conversations and funding and relationships and things. We did talk about culture is art. Culture is kind of like all art and practices and expressions. Another thing I forgot to add in there was a comment that I think, Ron, you were saying about even the bogan culture is still a culture. Like, there's still people sort of have that idea that there's a lack of culture, but no, everything's culture, right? Everything is seen through a cultural lens, and so I'll probably just draw a little bogan man there somewhere. But and then sort of we went into that little discussion about appropriation versus appreciation. What were the right questions that we should be asking as to sort of how to identify those? And we had Trevor and Clint and Callum sort of talk about that bull shark dance and the stories and the singing and the connection to, opening that up to the wider community. The biggest sort of theme, so again, my role is really just to sort of capture the main overarching concepts and dot points here, and sort of I think the main sort of theme that we're talking about is sort of that cultural safety and sensitivity, and how we bring that into this space in sort of a harmonising fashion, I guess, to get that the Aboriginal arts and the contemporary arts as those two worlds, to sort of bring them together. So I'll be doing the same thing today, and just like I mentioned yesterday, if there's anything you kind of want me to add, or if you, by the end of this, and I'll show you what I've put by the like the finalised version of today's one, just come up and let me know, and I'll be happy to sort of throw something up there as well. So yeah, that's me. Cheers. Thank you.
On that note, I'd love to invite Chad to the front here, and Chad's going to take us through his presentation. Thank you.
Kaya. So here's in the Noongar language, a beautiful language. Gona Moyon, that's good morning in my language, in Badi language. Thank you, Sandra, for your welcome to country. I want to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people. I acknowledge our elders, past and present. And isn't it a pleasure to be here in Walyalup. I love coming down to Fremantle. I live in the northern suburbs. It's a bit of a trek to the ocean, and I'm a saltwater person, so being here just gives me good lian. And for West Kimberley people, that's good feeling, good spirit, feeling mentally and feeling really good. And many of my mob stories are told here in this museum and at the shipwrecks. So it's always great to be in Fremantle. Thank you to the Fremantle Biennale team for inviting me to be part of the Conversations, Creative Conciliations. And also just want to congratulate them on bringing together such a great event. I think the topic that they've chosen and the way they've gone about bringing together the Biennale this year has been fantastic, and loving the topic for these discussions. So my name is Chad Crichton. I'm a Bardi and Yulnyul man from the Dampier Peninsula north of Broome, and I'm currently the CEO of the Aboriginal Arts Centre Hub of WA, or everyone just calls us ARCHWA. So we're part of a national network of peak bodies. There's 5 of us across the whole country. IACA over in Queensland, Arts in South Australia, Anchor and Desart in the Northern Territory, and of course ARCHWA here in Perth. So together we work very closely with other organisations like the Indigenous Art Code, Arts Law Australia, Copyright Agency of Australia, and the state and federal governments. So, our mission, ARCHWA, is to promote, empower and connect. So we promote by being a strong voice for Aboriginal art centres in WA. We empower, we encourage best practice, facilitate targeted training opportunities and encourage leadership within younger generations. And we connect. So we build strong networks with members and partners throughout WA and Australia. What else can I say about ARCHWA? So we are fairly young in terms of the network of peaks, and you're seeing our board on the screen at the moment. So we're fairly young. We're 5 years old, but our history goes back 5 years old as an independent entity, as a corporation in our own right. Our history goes back as far as 2009, where artists met at Revealed and called for a peak body to be established in WA. So we're very much a result of the artist community. Our board, who you saw just a minute ago, are made up of, it's a majority Indigenous board. It's made up of representatives from our membership, who are art centres that you're seeing on the screen right now. So there's about 30 art centres across the whole state, or who have some association with WA. So that's a bit about ARCHWA. I wanted to, I guess, talk quite closely around the theme that I believe Rohan has sort of worked with the team on developing, indigenising spaces, and Clothilde as well as who you heard from yesterday spoke about that. So in regard to the role Aboriginal art centres play in being Indigenous spaces for creativity. My history and work is sort of strongly been one at that grassroots level. I have worked many years ago, and actually Grant and we caught up earlier, and he remembers me from my early university days at UWA, where I did a Bachelor of Fine Art. I went on to work with the Art Gallery of WA, did many wonderful things there, and spent the last decade working in the Kimberley for the Kimberley Land Council in native title and heritage. So a lot of the work I've done is very much about facilitating and empowering Aboriginal people. And so what you're seeing on the screen at the moment, I guess the way we think about these things is, we have our Aboriginal culture and our society, and then we have the non-Aboriginal culture and society. And a lot of, this is quite broad, but specifically for art centres as well, at the centre of it is always culture. And art centres, they work in this space between two worlds. They're the bridge. They support artists with lots of different things. So finance, contracts, human resources, the business side of the arts, governance, meetings, marketing, sales, the list goes on and on. As a young person growing up in Broome, we were taught in primary school. I will go back one slide. I was taught in primary school we need to learn to walk in two worlds. So we're always, you talk that Broome lingo at home, and when you come to school, got to talk proper English. So I can whip it up with Broome lingo with all my mob back home, but when I'm sort of in these sort of spaces, can speak good English. But it's more than that. It's many, many different things, and it's that walking in two worlds that art centres help facilitate. You got to have a foot in each camp. So I guess, art centres, we can go to the next slide now. At the core of it, it's, what they do, the work they do is centred around culture, and really supporting what the elders and the artists want to do for themselves and for their community. Culture is always at the very essence of discussions, and many of our art centres, when they make decisions, they talk about, we've just had a project proposed to us, or there's an artist who wants to collaborate, or there's something that's come, and they get many, many requests and all kinds of things that people want to do with them. They always talk about what's the benefit to themselves, and will this support their community and their culture. And it's also about art making, of course, and those two are connected, and making an income. Outside of that, art centres are hugely important in the other things that they do for community. So they're not just places for making art, but because they're organisations that were created by that community, they also support the things that they need. So it could be other services like connecting with Centrelink, for example, use of a phone, use of internet, a computer, accessing the world outside of their community, youth programs, elders. It's amazing. I've gone and done pickups with art centre staff around community. You jump in the bus at 8 a.m. and go pick everyone up. Getting people, in their 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, who would maybe be sitting in front of the television all day, into a space with their colleagues, people they grew up with. It's a social space. They teach young people. They talk language. They record stories and their culture, and it's kept at the art centre. They're hugely important to community. And I guess the results of that is what we're currently seeing on the screen is connection to country, having the opportunity to, because art centres are funded partly by government in some cases, but they're also self-funded through sale of artwork. So they're supporting their own community by some of a percentage of the sale income coming back to the art centre, which allows for these kinds of activities. This is the mob up in Robin, Jullawalu Art Group. So they've been going out on country very often. I think they do like a monthly trip, take everyone out on country. They've really turned their sights on towards art making. In 2017, Njabani, the group who associated with Jullawalu Art Group, they received the determination in native title. Jullawalu have really started focusing since that time on what their members want and need, and art making is at the top of that list. Transmission of knowledge, these are Delaney and Peggy Griffiths from Warringah up in Kununurra. Phenomenal artists. That art centre is simply amazing. Delaney, she's learning from her grandmother, but she's now also one of their key artists in their new fabric workshop. So they do a number of amazing things at their art centre. They have a dance ground, they have a gallery where all their artwork is shown. They do a lot of public artwork, so this is one that's at the Kununurra Hospital. They're very well sort of established. They've been operating since the 1970s. They're the oldest art centre in the state. There's huge amounts of things that they do for their community. So yeah, I'll keep going. They've got a collection. Here's some more of what they do. They've got a collection of artworks, which is their legacy collection. They care for those works for their community and keep it there. They also employ local people to take care of it. I think they've got something like 13 local Indigenous staff members. So, they stretch their own canvas. They're doing slip casting now. They do ceramics. They do painting on canvas, of course. They do tourism. They do tours locally for people and hold an annual event, the annual muster, the big festival up there. So, back to indigenising spaces, art centres have been doing this for a long time. I think at the crux of it, when we think about indigenising spaces, it's, for me, like I want to refer to something people can maybe use a bit. So the Australia Council for the Arts has developed a set of protocols. You might be aware of it. If you're not, please check it out. You can see it on their website. So that document is protocols for using First Nations cultural and intellectual property in the arts. And that was released in 2019. So it outlines 10 principles. And I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll just list them. So 1, respect. 2, self-determination. 3, communication. Consultation and consent. 4, interpretation. 5, cultural integrity and authenticity. 6, secrecy and confidentiality. 7, attribution. 8, benefit sharing. 9, continuing cultures. And 10, recognition and protection. I want to focus just on 2 of those. So principle 1, respect. And within that, there's quite a lot to unpack, but focusing on cultural safety. And principle 2, self-determination, and sort of focusing in on Indigenous governance and decision-making. So often you may hear about Aboriginal people talk about cultural safety. This refers to the spaces we feel comfortable, own, can speak language, reflect on our history, have cultural and social behavioural and protocols in place, share our stories, and just be ourselves. So the Australia Council protocols, they had a sort of definition. So it's a cultural safe environment where First Nations staff, peers, artists, arts organisations and communities feel their protocols, beliefs, knowledges, histories, practices and expressions are understood and valued. One of the differences that, as the CEO of Archwa, that I'm always sort of talking to my staff about and and take direction from my board around, is that we have to stand out in these areas. So when we bring people to Perth, so for example, we've got our arts worker program at the moment here in Perth. Over the a 2-week period, and they're deep diving into what happens with their artwork when it leaves community. So doing quite an intensive program with the Art Gallery of WA and WA Museum. And there's representatives there from the Pilbara, from the Western Desert, and from the Kimberley. You know, we go the extra lengths to make sure people feel really safe and comfortable. We pick them up from the airport, take them to wherever they're staying, check them in. We make sure they're feeling okay about the whole program and spend a lot of time talking to them about how they're going. We always go that extra length to make sure they're feeling comfortable. We always start with a welcome to country when we come down to Perth. There's a lot to consider. And I guess that's something that as arts organisations we have to think about that when we're bringing Indigenous people into our programs or events or things that we want to do with them. I want to go to principle 2, so self-determination. And there's a lot to unpack in that as well, but just focusing in on Indigenous governance and decision making. Am I going for time?
You're good. Yeah, you're all right, Jed. Would you like some water? You're up. You're good.
So yeah, back to self-determination. So Article 3 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talks about this as Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. So I wanted to focus on these 2 elements of the Australia Council Protocol because they really do speak to what art centres are about. They're culturally safe spaces, but they're also governed by Indigenous people. The decision's always made around what the artists want to do. So the Aboriginal Art Centre model has been present in WA since the 70s when art centres in the Kimberley started to emerge, and that being Warringah was the first. The very first art centres started to emerge in the Northern Territory. I think that might have been in the 50s and 60s. At their core, they are places for culture, places for artist protection, for artists in order to navigate the Western world, and places to make and sell artwork. So this model produces a number of outcomes: income, cultural repository, language transmission, spaces for disadvantaged people, people with disabilities, elders and youth. The Art Centre model, I think, is one that we can all learn from, and I always like to talk to people about. If you've never been to an Aboriginal art centre, please go and visit one. I think they're amazing spaces. And I think we've got a little bit of time left.
Questions?
And what we might do is, just while questions are going, we'll just circulate through these images at the end, which are just some of the programs that we run. So our Aboriginal Art Worker program, and a couple of weeks ago we had our business Aboriginal Art Centre Forum up in Harbin, just to share with people down here in Perth, in the, so the things that we're doing with out there in the regions.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chad. One question that has, before we open it up to you guys in the audience, one question that's come through, Chad, is, as the 2 circles come together and create this, in-between space, which is often called very, very much a slippery space too, in how protocols are negotiated and enacted. How does your group negotiate that space when there are many wadulars out there that want to be there, and some of them have got great intent come to the table with a listening capacity rather than an agenda. But I'm reminded of some of the great work that's been done in, say, cultural mapping with art centres now, around establishing evidence for native title and Indigenous protected areas. There seems to be a strong self-determination there, and art centre driven projects with other relationships that we've been talking about. Can you speak about how some of them have perhaps been successful, and probably more importantly, in some ways for the forum and other questions, where do they fall over? Where do they fail?
So I think, there's a lot of different kinds of projects. There's a lot of different kinds of activities that people might be undertaking. And I think when you think about working in this space, it's, looking, if you've never worked with Aboriginal people before, I guess understanding that there are protocols, there are things that you need to consider, and they're not the same for everyone. There's 90, I think roughly 90 different language groups in Western Australia alone. And we're all very different people, different cultural backgrounds, different histories. I'm very conscious of that because I've got to work with quite a large number of different groups in Western Australia. I really take a lot of direction also from my board, so that's why they're there. They're representatives from different groups across the state. In the native title space, if you don't know, I guess what native title, the structure that exists is that when you receive a determination of native title by the court, you have to establish sort of a Western framework. So that's where you have to have a corporation and a legal entity that holds your native title on trust for the native title holders. You have to have a board. Usually that's around 12 people. There's ways that you can implement within those structures, and this is also speaking generally to Indigenous corporations like art centres. You can include ways of governing and representation that are culturally appropriate. So it could be representatives from different family groups, or depending if it's a big area of land, different places. But I think coming into all of this, you have to be aware that there are structures that exist. Even if you want to go out and do filming on certain places, you might need to get in contact with, or projects out on country, get in touch with native title bodies. So those entities that you create in native title are called PBCs, or Prescribed Bodies Corporate. So for my own mob, we've got our Badi Jawi PBC, which is made of representatives from the different clan groups in Badi Jawi country. There's about 5 to 7 different clan groups and 2 reps from each. So it depends on who you're working with, and if you want to do anything, it's the proper protocol. Up in our neck of the woods, the proper protocol is that you would table those things with our board, because it's their role to go and talk to their families and community. Like I said, there's many ways to sort of work in the space, but I guess being aware that sometimes decision making is a communal one as well. Stories are often owned by a community and not necessarily an individual. But again, that's different for different groups. Does that sort of answer your question?
That's good. That's good. I'd like to now bring the audience into any questioning. Are there any questions out there from Chad's talk? Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just interested to know how some of the COVID restrictions have been impacting art centres. There's still a lot of like travel restrictions in place in WA and around Aboriginal communities, and how has that been impacting the work either positively or negatively and some of the adaptations that art centres are making?
So if we go back to March last year, the biggest impact that was felt was the cancellation of Revealed. So for our members who attend Revealed, on average they make at the marketplace, they sell approximately $500,000, and about 100 to 130,000 through the exhibition. So straight away, that's money that did not go back to our communities. Fremantle Art Centre did a great job in then putting Revealed online in 2021, and we saw that art centres were able to sell their artwork through that online platform and marketplace. And the Darwin Art Fair is the other big one that we usually attend. There's quite a few now across the country. There's Sydney and Melbourne as well, and Desert Mob in Alice Springs. The Darwin Art Fair I'll just touch on because over 70 art centres attend that one every year in August, and they had to cancel the physical event twice, last year and this year. Last year they sold I think, don't quote me on this, but I think it was about 2.4 million online through their online sales platform, and this year I think 3.1 million. So that was the pivot that people make, that shift was the art fairs and markets were shifted online, and art centres themselves have also done quite a bit of work to their own online sales platforms. We've also been talking to government, so the federal government last year provided art centres that they fund through their Indigenous Visual Arts and Industry Support Program with $7 million to get through the hard times. That was COVID relief funding. And we talked to the WA government as well, and I believe there's other things sort of for art centres and Aboriginal artists to access to support online sales platforms and that sort of thing.
Any other questions? Yeah, one behind you, Tom.
Yeah, hi. Just a bit of spanner in the works, maybe. As we've been talking about creating interstitial spaces in this event yesterday, would you be comfortable to give us some broom lingo example?
It's hard without having another person to have a yarn with, but I guess our general greeting, just casually, is like, what now? Which has a lot of different sort of, what now, what you up to, how you going, how you been? So all the Broom mob, greet each other, what now, how you been? You sort of, you might say something a bit of a jokingly way, and someone sort of like saying, don't be silly. They would say, good at you. So if you want to learn a bit more, check out Mary G.
Yeah.
Mary G on YouTube. Mary G will give you lots of broom lingo. Yeah.
I think yeah, Sharon or you, Tom?
My question is something that is that I need to know, basically. If you have an existing exhibition, which is making a conversation about all sorts of things to do with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and you're taking it regionally to, for instance, Bunbury Art Gallery, and you've been asked to take it there to Bunbury Art Gallery. Is that something that you would need to actually, are you depending on someone like Bunbury Art Gallery to talk it over with local community, or is that something that as a curator you should do yourself? talk to the actual landowners down there?
I think you'd definitely be in communication with the gallery anyway, because it would be a partnership. So they would have, and I know Bunbury's also regional art galleries connected to the city of Bunbury. So they would have certain layers of sort of governance in place, I'd assume. So they should have an Aboriginal advisory committee of some sort at the city, but whether or not Bragg itself has their own advisory committee, I mean, I think that's just something you have a conversation with their director and other staff about, and if they don't have that in place, how do you go about sort of having a discussion with the mob on the ground there? Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? Any risky questions out there? Yes, another one. Yeah, behind you, Tom. Yeah, no, this is good.
I have to say I'm totally not in the art space, so that's why I usually hold back. But the diagram you had in there, you know, this culture, I've become such a hater of these diagrams because they're sort of, you know, they separate everything and put everything in boxes. So I wonder, from your perspective, have you ever tried to sort of create those same diagrams in a more realistic, Buddhistic, Aboriginal spirit kind of way? And if so, would it be possible for you to sort of add these maybe to talks, and just, because I find I do that quite often. I do the, you know, the old way, and then the way I sit at home and just let rip and create, and it usually is quite an interesting feedback. People just go, oh wow, you know, because culture goes everywhere. It's just, I mean, it's at the center, but it radiates into everything and affects everything. And to sort of have a visual representation of that, I find always quite enlightening.
Yeah, I think the question was, you know, the Western way of representing the circles and the interchange, as opposed to a more Indigenous diagrammatic way of showing those relationships. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that's a diagram we often use in that we've been using for a long time in that corporation sort of structural space, and trying to keep it easy for everyone to understand. You know, that, and also just want to make sure like people understand it's not about you know, white or black. It's just that and it is about cultural differences, I think. I think it's, you know, like it was mentioned earlier that, you know, Bogan culture is a culture. You know, it's this recognition that we are all people, but we all have sort of different societal sort of norms within our cultural framework and society. And in saying that, that's different across all Aboriginal people as well. I don't think that you can't really paint us all with the same brush. It's you really need to approach it with you know, talking to the particular people you want to work with and understanding who they are and what their view of the world is. But I guess that was just a diagram just to try and keep things really simple and try and explain it the best way possible. Yeah, that could maybe everyone could understand a bit. Yeah, but I know where you're coming from, and might be a great exercise for you know, maybe an artist to sort of work through. Yeah.
It's a good question. I'm reminded of some of the early work in settlement planning and design in remote communities, where you know, communities were asked to paint a relationship around settlement planning and design, as opposed to employing a Western town planner to come in and lay out the housing lots. And that was quite an exciting time for healthy living and housing programs. But look, can everyone put their hands together for Chad? And thank you so much, Chad. And I'd like to invite our next speakers up to Rowan Kickett and Sandra Harbin. And I believe we've got Jazz online. Is that correct?
Yep, there she is.
Ah, there you go, Jazz. Welcome.
Can you guys see me?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, I think Tom's done that. Yeah, yep. If you...
Yeah. Hi, Jazz. Welcome on the screen, and welcome, Auntie Sandra. This segment we're just going to talk about a collaboration between Jazz and Sandra, and I think after the discussion from Chad, he really brought out that within those there are a lot of Indigenous spaces that are Indigenous-led, and we have our own systems, we have our own protocols, and I think this is a great example of those protocols and the differences between Aboriginal people across Australia. As we know, Jazz is all the way over in Sydney, the opposite side of the country, and her mob are completely different to Noongar mob, and we'll see that in this collaboration space when we talk about how Auntie Sandra and Jazz work together on this project. So I'll hand it over to you, Jazz. Do you want to talk about, how did you become part of the Biennale to start with, and then talk a bit about the concept and project?
Thanks, guys. So lovely to be able to join you. I wish I could actually be there. That's kind of devastating. But it's really lovely to be phoning in. I'm actually on beautiful Bundjalung country today, and it's a total gift to be just on these beautiful waterways and land and skies. And I just want to acknowledge and pay respect to the custodians of this place who have cared for it since always, and to also acknowledge my Wiradjuri elders and ancestors who are quite a way away from here, down south, across the mountains and on the rivers. So, and to all you mob on Noongar country, where I'm not, but imagine. So this project, I was just incredibly lucky that the Biennale got in touch and asked if I wanted to come over and have a poetic response to the brief and the ideas of the exhibition this year, which I work mostly as a poet, a little bit as a filmmaker, and it was a really exciting opportunity to get to respond to place. Whenever I'm working with a sort of built environment, I'm very conscious of place and country and responsibility, custodianship, and so the invitation to come over to Fremantle and think about that all, for me, really started with engaging with Noongar country and engaging with the waterways, which as a river person myself, I felt very, I understood the brief in some ways, and walking along the river with, the team that had pulled together the exhibition, I was really struck by the similarities, despite massive differences as country, what's happening in the rivers there is very different to what's happened over here, but still there's this disruption and this colonial intervention that has been incredibly violent. And I mean, as we know, when we harm our waterways, we're harming people, we're harming country, we're harming kin, we're harming all that rely on those water sources. And so I was really just totally struck by how remarkable those violences have been, but also how strong country is despite that, and how strong the community is despite that, and trying to find the balances between those two things. And so that was what I was thinking about. I was doing heaps of research around the site where the Biennale is taking place and thinking about extraction and intervention. I was really aware that it's not my story to tell. As a Wiradjuri person, I'm very much a guest when I'm in Fremantle, and so I wanted to talk about what had happened, but I didn't want to overstep, which is where these sorts of conversations started. But I guess just to say a little bit more about the project before we get into the collaborative element more fully, is to say that the work that I ended up producing is a very large poem. I mean, the text is actually not particularly long, but the scale is very large. A poem that responds to site. I remember walking down by the river with Tom and Kat and kind of pointing at the bridge and saying, like, is anyone using the bridge? And they looked at me and were like, I mean, if we can get permission to use the bridge, which seemed at the time incredibly unlikely, I believe there was about 9 million steps to get permission to use the site. And brilliantly, the team did manage to do that. So I'm so grateful. But it's a poem that hangs across the bridge facing the water with a text that's responding to the disruption of the waterways, but the strength of the waterways. And then another half of the poem, which sits underneath the bridge itself, that the audience can sort of walk under and through and be immersed in. And that half of the poem is very much about the trees that build and hold the bridge and how those trees were felled down south and moved away from their home and hold the stories pre-colonisation and have this just wild impact on them and get moved to another place where they then learn new stories and respond to country in that way. And they're these warriors that stand strong and tell so much despite all that has happened to them. So that is the work. To get there, collaborative dialogues was incredibly important. I wanted to know so much about the country and what had happened, the waterways and the significance, and I was so conscious of not wanting to overstep, but wanting to be really respectful of the significance of country. So yeah, I think that's my my answer about the work, before we get into, you know, then how much you, Rowan, and Auntie Sandra made it possible.
I like the how powerful the poem is, and the powerfulness of it is in the simplicity of the actual poem itself. And when we look at, it's not an easy thing to do, to create that type of work. And I remember you mentioned the actual process of it was quite intense. When people might see it and they think, oh, that wouldn't have taken much work, but how much work was actually behind the scenes in the creative process?
I think that's the sign of a good poem, personally, is that it's accessible but comes from a rich foundation, which can be emotional or it can be research or whatever. And I think this work came from both those places. It was a very immediate emotional reaction to sight, and then just a wealth of research to try and distill very complex histories, I think, with neatness. And Grant also helped a huge amount in finding some of those research papers. I read all about the colonial intervention of country at that time and how the bridge came to be and how the water came to be disturbed in the way it was. And yeah, to end up with, I don't know, a couple hundred words to try and tell an incredibly complex history is a strange process. But if it leads an audience to think more deeply about place or to be more curious, then that to me is a successful work, and particularly one that is site-based and site-responsive. To be able to be in dialogue with country is such an honour and something that I'm so grateful to have been able to do, which, you know, then being able to translate into Nyungar. So the poem, I should have explained this at the top, this poem sits in Nyungar and in English, and that was incredibly important to me. I am always thinking about language and Wiradjuri language, and obviously it was in no way appropriate to work with Wiradjuri while producing work on Nyungar Budja, but I wanted to integrate the language of the land so that the language could understand and be a part of that dialogue, because that's what the piece is about. So I was very much thinking in Wiradjuri when I started writing the piece. I'm not fluent in Wiradjuri, but I was thinking about how I would explain it, because Wiradjuri is a much more beautiful language than English could ever try to be. And I was pretty confident that Nyungar would have more similarities with Wiradjuri than it would with English. And so trying to then go Wiradjuri, English, Nyungar to get that translation process happening was also a lot of work in kind of not simplicity, but in thinking about the languages that we spoke pre-colonisation and actually what was happening with them.
And I remember we had the creative conciliation discussions around this topic of the appropriateness of using your language over here. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Sandra?
Thanks, Rowan. Yeah, well, I was really happy to do the translation of the poem for Jazz. And as she said, it is important to, you know, acknowledge the first language of the land, the Noongar language. And so, you know, obviously with the thought that Jazz had given in terms of using Noongar language and not Wiradjuri, well, it makes sense. It wouldn't be appropriate to use Wiradjuri language. So, you know, so the project was a beautiful opportunity to bring our language out into the public space, into the art space, and, you know, and showcase it. And that's something that I'm very passionate about is, you know, showcasing Noongar language. And so as a result of Jazz, you know, approaching me as a Noongar person, you know, in the Biennale space, I was really pleased to do that.
And how did you find those creative conciliation sessions that we had, Jazz, when we actually had those discussions? Because they were quite interesting, I thought, at the time.
Totally, and I was so grateful. I think I'd been really anxious about how to produce this work ethically and in the way that I thought it needed to be done. And getting to just sit down and have a yarn with you, mob, and talk about like responsibility, reciprocity. And one thing that I thought was really interesting was just opportunities for First Nations folk to collaborate without an intermediary. So being able to kind of have these cross-continent dialogues, you know, dialogues around waterways and river systems and responsibility and country and community, these things that are very resonant all across the continent, but obviously we're coming from, you know, just impossible distances really as well. And the opportunity to have those conversations and see where the commonalities, you know, obviously are, but also where there's differences and where, you know, I remember listening to some of the creation stories and ancestor stories that you guys were talking about, and I was like, oh, that's not how our water is formed. This is really good to know. I'm not going to tell that story because it's not mine to tell, but it's so important to understand those huge differences and really important cultural differences to be able to proceed ethically, I think. So those conversations were totally key. I don't think this work could be if it wasn't for those dialogues.
I remember the discussions around how do we pay respect to your mob and your language and the Noongar language all in the one project, and how to do that ethically. And I think the way you've gone about it by writing it in your language and then translating it manages to hit every nail on the head when it comes to that topic. And I remember that was quite an interesting way of, you know, how do we actually go about that in those discussions. And there was quite a long discussion, and a lot of people were like really sort of racking their brains a little bit of how to do that. What was sort of going through your head at that time when we were talking about, you know, how do we pay respect to each culture and the languages itself?
Yeah, I remember in some of those conversations, different people suggesting like, oh, it could sit in Wiradjuri and English and Noongar, or it could sit in Wiradjuri and Noongar. And I always thought that it would be odd for Wiradjuri to sit in that way on that country surrounded by Noongar. It just, not so much for an audience, because that's not who my kind of, a human audience wasn't really my primary focus. I was thinking about country and how country would be hearing, and that it would be rattling for my ancestors and for your ancestors, and for the land to be listening to the language in that way. I mean, English is already this really awful intervention that we kind of have to function within. And I imagine that country isn't stoked on that. So I didn't want to introduce another level of complexity in that way. And I didn't want an audience, so a human audience, who maybe has a relationship to Noongar or maybe has a relationship to English. I really wanted Noongar to be the focus there. And I thought introducing Wiradjuri would confuse what was most important in that instance, in this site. And so that was a kind of interesting process. I love my language, and I love any opportunity to work with it. But we know customs and what is right, and we all sort of collectively decided that just wasn't culturally correct. And I'm really grateful to be able to have those dialogues and to have been able to kind of work out those kinks. Because it's important that everyone feels good. It's most important that community and country feels good.
If I can just add, listening to Jazz, she's made me think of some things that I could say. And when we're collaborating, across Aboriginal cultures, it's about, things that guide us as Noongar people that I think that helps us then to make sure that we practice those things. So, for example, the Noongar principles and values that we live by are things like kundan, which is about respect, and kanya, about shame, and straight away, for me, they are things that come to mind. So if I'm going to be working with another Aboriginal group, I'm going to be really mindful of, like, kanya, because in a sense that's about, and kundan, well, of course I'm going to pay respect, because that's something that I think is innate in me and all Aboriginal people. And so, for example, Chad spoke earlier about Lian, and I thought, oh yeah, that's, I hope, what everyone picked up when I talked about Weirin. The Noongar word is Weirin, and the Kimberley mob use Lian. And so it's about our intuition, it's about what's in us, it's innate. And so I think it just comes natural that when we're working with other Aboriginal people from other parts of country, that we use those, those laws, those guiding values. And so in a sense, I think it sort of comes naturally. We don't have to have it all written down because, on paper, because we have those values, those principles, and it speaks to us and it tells us how to behave and what to say and when not to say it. And we pick up on the Weirin, the spirits all around us, and they guide us. They guide us. Thank you.
And I think that comes back to having cultural guidance and having a responsibility to uphold that cultural aspect in all the projects that we do. And like Carney said, it might not be written down in a specific format, but it's part of our culture and it's a part of who we are as people.
Yeah, over this way we'd just say don't be gammon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that's being raised here now, and Chad talking about Lian and now Weirin, Sandra's mentioned. I think many people observed the importance of that in the creative conciliation workshops that we had. I think for one tangible outcome, there was a questioning around the questions. Some were inappropriate to ask an artist to explain, or as perhaps Chad might say, the Lian was not there in the room. It just wasn't present. So then everyone started to take account of that importance and move on, or abandon the meeting. And I've working in Broome, for example, I've learnt that very clearly, that sometimes it's just not the time or the spirit, the Lian or the Weirin, to encroach on any subject matter. It's time to go home.
And I think what you're alluding to is, with those questions, are they, the right questions to ask, or?
Yeah.
And I think the right thing is it actually a question that you're asking, or are you challenging?
Yes.
And that's a big difference between, are you challenging someone on their cultural perspective, or are you just asking a question? And it's something that I experience a lot of, and as soon as I talk about my cultural experience, they react within a split second, and I'm like, well, the quicker they respond, they're not really responding on something that they've thought about. They're just trying to challenge me and create a debate. And why are we debating a cultural perspective anyway? It's something that you need to listen, understand, and if you are going to ask a question, make sure you actually make it a question from an informed point of view, rather than just constantly challenging people it's something that I've experienced a lot, and something within these creative conciliation sessions has been really great. And like you said, sometimes it was like, was that a question that should have been asked, or is it a challenge, or is it a question?
Yeah.
So yeah, I hope our creative conciliation session with you wasn't like that. But yeah, I've felt really good around that discussion, because it was a very important discussion around the appropriateness of that culture, and really shows the system that Aboriginal people have in place around this project, and the outcome of it, and how it's been such a beautiful process and a journey.
Yeah, I mean, one other thing, Jazz, you're probably not aware, but I've been observing your work and the agency that it's now creating in Fremantle. I mean, the collaboration's been very powerful, and I noticed the film crews down there yesterday, and I think it, this is perhaps a little bit over time, but or it should have happened earlier, but we do have a campaign in Fremantle about the future of the old bridge. And I think your work, whether it was intentional or not, but its political agency has now become very, very important. I mean, not many people were asking the same sort of ideas or inquisitiveness or curiosity that your work has raised about the future of the bridge. So now the bridge is being seen in a completely different lens, I think. And I've been quite disappointed as a Fremantle resident that it's taken the Biennale to do that. I mean, maybe that's good, that's a fantastic outcome, but I think it says something about Fremantle and its culture that that is very lacking in some ways, without being too gloomy about it. But the way you speak of the bridge and its country origins has been very important to Wali Alup, and Sandra's recognised those connections to country. I think the engineers should be here today, in the back row at least.
That's so interesting to hear that. I remember the first time, I came and visited, and Tom told me a little bit about the sort of controversy surrounding what was going to happen with the bridge, and that the title of my work that sits on the bridge is called These Words Will Remain, and it was very much a nod at, even if the bridge is gone, the stories that the bridge holds and the water holds is still there. And we live in a sort of colonial society that ties so much power to physical representation in the built environment, when we know that that's just the thing that's on the surface, right? And that the stories are always there and always held. And so that's very interesting to hear about sort of what's happening with the bridge. And, it seems devastating, doesn't it? The idea that you would build a structure like that and take those beautiful trees from country in that way and then discard it. That to me is very troubling. So the idea that, I could in some tiny way be helping the dialogue around reconsidering that approach and that destruction so many times over is quite gratifying.
Yeah. Sandra, can I ask you a question before we open up to the audience? Is just the importance of bringing language to this project. And I'm just reminded of a conversation that Tom had the other day with Kat, a fellow director, is just how the audio has played such a great importance in the Biennale, that we not only are able to take in and sense the work by touching and feeling and seeing, but we're now listening to the work. And and be interesting to get some feedback from the audience on how the Biennale has been very much about listening to art. Can you speak about how your words are now? I mean, your other project, The Gathering Space, which I think we'll talk at another time, but has been a classic example where you've brought sight and place into being by your audio projection.
Through the language?
Yeah, through language, yeah.
Obviously, if you look at the the different spaces, such as the one that Jazz has done, the one at the Gathering Place, a few of the schools have been involved in the Biennale projects. So when you asked the question, Grant, I had to quickly think, about the language, and thinking about each of those spaces. Without the language, we're not bringing the Noongar story, or we're not showcasing our culture. So if you take all the language away, for people walking past or wanting to, enjoy that space, they wouldn't be able to connect with the Noongar people, the Noongar culture. So I think that through the language in these projects, that was the key to connecting Noongar culture to that art space. And so, take all the language away, and what would it really mean? Take all the language out of the seating at the Gathering Place, take out the Noongar language out of Jazz's work. You would be left with English and with Wiradjuri, and the land wouldn't connect, the spirits wouldn't connect. And I think that as a result, we talked about earlier about Leanne and Weir, etc. And I really truly believe that when things are right, when they're put together, then the Budja speaks to us, the land speaks to us, and everything in it. And by that I mean the Weirin comes, and it gives the good energy. And so, because they know the language is there, the Noongar can, hear the language when people are reading it, and so they're hearing it all the time. So it was really, really key, I think, to some of the projects.
Thank you. Now, questions from the audience. Any questions for Jazz, Sandra and Rowan on this project? Yeah.
Hello and thank you. My name is Sula. A thank you to all of the artists and the organisers for the Biennale for bringing the conversations. I particularly liked in the presentations today the idea of working intergenerationally, whether you're at an art centre or whether you're in a project, and I'd love to see a lot more of that. My question is to the artists and the art managers, First Nations, around your work and around that transitional space and that in-between space, and what your thoughts are about what can be done to support your work, because there's expectations from mob and there's expectations from white fellas as well, and that must be quite a bit of work to navigate. So I was just interested in your thoughts around that, because you're carrying a lot in that sense.
Did you want to talk to that, Rowan? I mean, Rowan's is going to reveal some interesting futures here about how the Noongar arts mob are expecting new futures in supporting projects. Yeah.
I think with the expectations within the Biennale, like Tom and Kath have been fantastic with their expectation. They really let basically mob dictate the project on this one, and particularly being Wiradjuri and Noongar, they kind of just stepped back and just let that unfold naturally, and let us, create that project without any real expectation from them. And they let go of that, and they didn't really interfere, which, that says a lot to the Biennale to be able to do that in this space. And I thought that was one of the reasons why it was, there was no interference really. It was just a beautiful relationship between only Sandra and Jazz, and they worked together really closely on this, and without any real interference or expectations. And that's one thing I thought was really, really good about this project.
I think I might add something as well, if that's all good, which is to say on that kind of balancing of responsibilities, we've already talked about like why Nyungar had to take precedence in this work. I think also it's kind of relevant to say it's a really great educational tool, right? In my work, I've done a bit of teaching in my life, and any opportunity to work with first languages is this incredible gateway for a lot of people, a lot of white fellas and a lot of migrant folk to start thinking about land with greater complexity. And so even though this work is for Nyungar country and it's for mob, you know, from this side, from the ways that you guys are, it's also for audiences who want to engage more deeply, right? And that can be folk who are able to access the poem through the English and potentially have then a greater engagement with the Nyungar text and think more deeply about place and think about how those Nyungar words have been on that site for always, have been born with the land. And so the poem, I hope, the work itself has this kind of dual responsibility to Nyungar country, Nyungar mob, but also to people who are on country and want to engage more deeply. And I think both those things are incredibly important. And if this work can kind of service in some way a greater educational relationship, that's, I think, really exciting to be able to balance those responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think with that third space, I think you're talking about within the two, that third space which Chad showed on the chart, we have, you know, systems that Aboriginal people already use, and we have our own protocols. And then you have a system and protocols from a Western perspective, and that third space is where they meet and they collaborate. So that's where that relationship needs to be as strong as possible. And I'll talk a bit later in the last session with Sandra about that relationship and how it's important as well.
Yeah. Any other questions? We've got about 7 minutes to go before the break. Any others? Yeah, Sharon again. Beautiful. No, go for it. You're in a safe space.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think I'm really on board with respect and self-determination. When it comes to respect, I think, as a Wodjala here, I'm very aware of the history of this place, and I can see why Noongar people, just talking about this place, Noongar people are very affected by the fact that their language was taken from them, that they weren't allowed to speak it, and that their, English is not the most beautiful language in the world, but it is the language of my culture, or most of my culture, which is Irish, Scottish, English, and Spanish, and to an English-speaking person, because that's the language that I learned from the time I was born, it does mean something to me. So I really hope everyone's aware of respect going between all of us to each other, and bearing in mind our history here, which I'm very aware of, and that you're aware of we have respect and we have shame, the same two things that Sandra spoke of, and coming to terms with the shame that somebody like me feels about the history is quite a raw thing. So there's a Wodjala perspective, I guess, and I just wanted it to sit in the space. Yes, for whatever that means.
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, perhaps just to open up the address to that important question, I think, as we draw circles across the sand, I think Wadjulas need to do some homework as well. I think we haven't really done enough to come to the interstitial space in many disciplines. Obviously, some disciplines are leaders in the academy and other foray, but there's a lot of homework I think Wadjulas have got to do. A lot of discussion before we even bother, I think, the interstitial space. And Chloe talked about that yesterday, is preparing audiences in other ways, educational ways. I mean, I'm also reminded about the maxim that, multiculturalness is completely different to Indigenous rights. And in Australia, we often confuse the two. We try to bring those two debates to the centre circle. I think and we haven't touched much on Indigenous rights in many ways in the Biennale and in these conversations. But if we were to put up the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights in this foray, I think we'd be surprised about the responsibilities the artist should take to honour that declaration. So, I mean, it's a great question. It's a difficult one. There are no easy answers and easy solutions to that. But I think the best way to learn new ways is by experience and just getting our own acts together. Now, that might take a lot of homework, might take new education. It might take disciplines that are led by Indigenous people to help us Wadjulas. Chloe spoke of the difficulties of reconciliation yesterday. Often it's white fella outcomes there. Often it's white fella led in reconciliation. It's not true reconciliation, often. Things are changing in that space, and I think reconciliation goes to the heart of your question. But probably enough from me. I'd like to pass it on to the guest speakers. Yeah? No answer. Jazz, did you want to respond to that? Just as
something that came into my head when I was
2 minutes.
Question, which is that I have a relationship to English, which is, a bit fraught. It's the language that I'm definitely most fluent in, but it is loaded with all sorts of strange histories. And, I'm Wiradjuri on my dad's side, I'm Irish on my mum's side. Both those cultures have strained relationships with English. But I want to just read you the smallest little text, actually, that I was reading this morning by a poet called Gustavo Perez Fermat, who wrote the most beautiful poetry collection called Bilingual Blues. And I'm just going to read you this tiny little section from it because I think it's really relevant to this question. And I was reading it this morning, and that's just one of my favourite things ever. I always return to it. And these few lines are, "The fact that I am writing to you in English already falsifies what I wanted to tell you. My subject, how to explain to you that I don't belong to English, though I belong nowhere else." And that's the little quote, which I think is something that, myself, and I'm sure a lot of people who have strained relationships with English for whatever reason of colonisation or otherwise, I imagine that resonates with a lot of folk.
Yeah. Thanks, Jazz. Did anyone else want to say anything before we close up?
I just sort of wanted to say that one of the charts we looked at was walking in two worlds. And so I know we're talking about, the question of English versus, first language of the land. And I thought, who's walked in two worlds? Really, it's only the Aboriginal people that have been able to, in the last 200 years, walk in two worlds. And so, in a sense, it's the Wadjulas that are now having to learn how to walk in the two worlds, because we as Aboriginal people, Noongar people, are now having opportunities to come into the public space, to have a voice, to share our stories, our culture, our language, And, you know, if that's challenging to people, well then, you know, that's what you have to deal with. And so, for the last 200 years, we have walked in two worlds, and, you know, we've had to.
Yeah. Thanks, Sandra. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and special thanks to our speakers today, especially Jazz, it's always a bit tricky zooming in from another place, another country. So thanks, Jazz, thanks to Rowan, and thanks to Sandra. And can we all give them a round of applause? Thanks, Jazz. Look, it's a great privilege here that the Biennale is now bringing together and inviting Karen Jacobs to this talk with Rowan Kickett. I'm looking for Karen's bio here, and I will read it if it's okay. Karen. Karen is a traditional owner of Whadjuk country with a passionate focus on developing and encouraging Aboriginal people's involvement in enterprise and business opportunities. Karen is a Fremantle Biennale Advisory Board member and has led an extensive career in Aboriginal cultural heritage, environmental management, cultural tourism and education. Throughout her career, she has worked in the probity and procurement, financial management, marketing and promotion of Aboriginal engagement across numerous industries. Karen is an active leader in furthering the Noongar community. She's held a number of professional positions and memberships, currently including Director Secretary of Noongar Property Holdings, Chairperson of Perth Noongar Foundation, and Independent Director of Kuruma Mataturtura Limited. How's that? Close?
Say KML.
KML, that's the one. Thank you. And thanks, Karen, so much for coming today. And everybody knows Rowan. So over to you, Rowan and Karen, on how you want to talk about the Mumbakai project. And I must say that Alona, is that all right to say, or did you want to talk about Alona's? Apologies. Yeah. Thank you.
You might be wondering why Alona's not here. She's had a family emergency, so she's had to take off, and I've just stepped in for her. I want to just talk about the very first conversations that Tom had with me about Mumbakai, and at the time he was trying to explain to me this drone project, and I was trying to get my head around what exactly he was talking about. And when I finally understood, I was like, wow, what a project that would be. And I think the conversations were around, you know, what type of artists we could be suited for this. And I threw out the idea of how about we find an emerging Noongar artist and potentially launch their career from this project. And straight away Tom loved the idea, didn't even hesitate. And then the discussions were around how do we support an emerging artist around this project, and how do we go around the consultation process in an ethical manner. And that's where Karen's stepped in and given us all the guidance along that. Do you want to speak to that, Karen?
Yeah, because when it comes to Aboriginal engagement, it's not something that you do every day, I guess, within any industry area. So a lot of people don't find it as part of their core focus. And the best way to achieve good and meaningful Aboriginal engagement is to have an Aboriginal person actually facilitate or co-facilitate that process. It helps in breaking down a whole heap of dilemmas, especially around improving the relationship with people and getting to know people. And also with a lot of Aboriginal elders, you need to develop trust and the consistency and voice as well as that contact person. And the purpose that you're actually developing up in the engagement approach or relationship needs to be meaningful, and I think traditional owners need to know that their voice and their intellectual knowledge is actually going to be valued in the whole process. So I guess the best way, and not to say that non-Aboriginal people can't do this, but the fastest and the easiest approach in developing any good relationship with traditional owners is to have an Aboriginal person facilitate that process. And I guess I was fortunate enough for Tom and Grant to come and approach me about facilitating a traditional owner approach to the whole Crossings 21 events, and then Mumbukai, as to the extent of the Aboriginal engagement, as well as gathering the knowledge and the creative, so from the cultural contents, from each traditional owner, the significant stories about Walyalup and why it's important to them. Why is this area still valued today, and what are the significant locations or places of importance that need to be reiterated into any creative and conversation line going forward. And I guess, and again, the easiest way to do that is to have an Aboriginal person speaking to Aboriginal people and gaining that knowledge, because often we often go a lot deeper because we know a lot more of the information. Especially we're all being privileged to different storylines, be with the same outcome. When we talk about our dreaming stories or our family's connection to country, they're all very similar, but they're also very independent of each other. So gaining that trust and that knowledge to get that information so that it can be incorporated into the development up of the background and any cultural content within documents or heritage studies, so that then the creative and artists or a collaboration of artists can look at that information and say, all right, which is the actual approach that we're going to take. So I'll leave it there because I can keep talking for quite some time. I'll take up all 20 minutes talking about
No, you're all right. It's good.
And yeah, when being part of those facilitation sessions with all the different families, and the way they, I think there was a little bit of a hurdle first up where the female voices weren't being heard over the male voices, and I think it was Uncle Walter Maguire decided, we should split up into two groups with men and women and talk about different stories from a male and a female perspective. And that worked really well. And, from past experience, it is quite daunting for a young artist to be part of these facilitation processes. And I've been in front of bodies of elders and presenting my work, and it's very intimidating. Sometimes it can go south pretty quickly if it's not done in the right manner. And I've experienced that myself. And leading up to these facilitation sessions, I was actually quite nervous for a loner. And I was kind of stressing out. And right from the very first outset, the very first things that Karen did was she made sure everybody knew what their role was in that process. And as soon as she said that, I just relaxed something, chronically. I was just so relieved to have that right from the output, because that's where things can go south quickly, is people overstepping the mark of what they're actually there for. And when she outlined exactly what the roles were, that set the tone for the day and for the sessions, and that maintained a lot of integrity within that space. And everybody was heard, everybody was comfortable, and everybody knew what they were there to do. So I think that was a great initiative straight off the bat, and Karen did a fantastic job facilitating those sessions. Yeah.
Thank you. So do you want to talk to us about, so from an Aboriginal artist's perspective, when it comes to engaging with it, even though we're Aboriginal people, and like you just said, it can be very nerve-wracking and off-putting, and not knowing exactly what your relationship is with some of the elders because they are from a different family. We have, within Whadjuk country, within this region, there are 8 apical ancestors, so we go a long way back to where our bloodlines are all derived from. But that means today we have probably some 43 Aboriginal families that make up the stronghold of the descendants from those 8 apical ancestral lines. So when we're consulting, realistically we should have about 40 people in the room, and if we're representing both male and female perspectives, which there are very separate roles, as Rowan just said, we split up into separate groups because the females had a very different role as the guardians of culture and the educators and the nurturers up to a certain point. So their role and responsibilities on country and for people were somewhat different to the men. So again, you'll only get those voices or that content often when we split up in the room, and then I think we even started talking about pre and postnatal. So we can't talk about those sorts of issues in front of the men because it's women's business. But in certain parts of Fremantle, there are birthing sites. So why are they significant? And what did we do during those practices to bring it right down? And having Ilona, I know, sitting in with us for that process, it gave her some really, really good ideas about the direction she was going to take. Hence, developing that whole creative along Joondalup, being the woman with the long flowing hair and what that meant. So, and of course, you're seeing the drone light shows. We're into the second weekend. Well, tonight is the last night of the second weekend, and I think the storyline's been very creative in providing an education process in a very different way to the community.
Yeah, and I think the way of keeping the artistic integrity within that project was by the two groups jotting down all the different stories of the area, what would be appropriate to tell, and then Alona got to go through those stories and sort of choose which ones resonated with her the best as an artist, and then it was decided, what was appropriate out of those stories to show at what location, and so she got to pick out of those stories how she was going to create that side of things and what resonated with her the most, and which to me, the artistic integrity and cultural integrity, there can be some friction between it, because some elders might be adamant that they want this specific story told in this specific way, but then how does that have any artistic integrity to the artist itself? So they're the kind of fine line that we're trying to avoid in these types of projects. And I've been, I've got a few examples of presenting concepts and stuff to elders, and they've just completely dismissed it and said, no, we want this instead, which what they were suggesting didn't really have any relevance to the site or to the artist. So there was a lot of discussions, a lot of friction, and this is a good way of, just combating that issue of what is appropriate from the elders' side of things and what is creatively appealing to the artist itself.
It's funny you say that, because you get a group of Aboriginal people in the room, especially oldies, and they'll talk about everything but the location that has the footprint for the art project. Like, they'll talk about the Swan Valley, their connection to Bunbury, their connection to the Scarp, out there at the island. So, and then trying to rein everybody back in can be a very difficult thing. So I kind of always find that in any engagement process, allow an extra hour or so in that conversation piece, because things are going to happen that are going to be outside of your control. But sometimes oldies, I kind of find a lot of our elders need that time to talk with each other, because they actually don't get time to sit down and yarn with everyone outside of these processes. So in one way, one of the benefits is that we're bringing the oldies together, and they get a chance to actually, reconnect with each other, have a laugh about different things that have gone on. But in those little yarning conversations, there's a lot of interesting information that if you're, quick about it, just jot down a few things that come up that you're actually listening to. Because then when you're going back and getting to the point about, the actual purpose that people are there for, you can say, right, in that conversation I just heard you were talking about such and such who was a jockey, down near Clarenstown, an association to Woodman Point and Coogee Beach, and, there's projects down there, and then we can talk about old Willie Worrell, who was a jockey, but, and that came up in conversations. We didn't even know at that point, sorry, I'm talking about a whole other project, but we didn't know at that point that we even had Aboriginal jockeys going back into the 1930s and 1940s. And what their role and responsibility and how they fell into that role. So there's lots of, and these all come up in conversation about things that might be a little bit left of field, but they're actually associated to the story or the project that you're working on. So, and even when we talk about, the woman with the long flowing hair in Joondalup, we've got a suburb called Joondalup, and it couldn't be any further away up the other side of the city. So, even Aboriginal people are saying to me, well, why have you called that drone show, this name, when that's associated to that lake system right up in the northern suburbs? So then we talk about in our dreaming stories, this is the association, that it just isn't allocated up there because that's where the lakes are, or that's where it's assumed that Joondalup, that's the purpose of that location, is all about this woman who used to collect children. So it's putting things into perspective, but there is a lot that comes out in that approach. So like I said, if you're engaging or having conversations with Aboriginal people and you're on a project that may have some timelines, I kind of, easily add another hour or two in that timeline just for conversation.
And again, like I said before, this project, it was almost Indigenous-led in a sense, and again, Tom and Kat, stepped back and allowed that to happen, and allowed us to do, the systems and protocols that we have in our culture, and let that run along with the actual project itself, and help support an emerging artist through this process at the same time. And it shows that importance of, allowing on an Aboriginal project to have that autonomy over it, and to be able to step back and watch and just see it unfold. I think Tom and Kat probably learnt a lot from that, which was really good. And just, I'd like to thank them for being able to just step back and allow that to happen in this space, which was really good.
Yeah, often, as a traditional owner myself, I get invited to a lot of meetings, and I'm often sitting in the audience, and if I hear a non-Aboriginal person talk about Aboriginal matters that are really significant to us, I almost turn off straight away, because it's not an Aboriginal person talking to us about the relevance and the significance. So I think there's a lot of assumed responsibilities, if I can put it that way, that a non-Aboriginal person takes on, but it actually takes twice as long to develop up, like I said, a credible relationship with traditional owners when that happens. So if it's always better when it's Aboriginal-led. I think we make account for a lot of the cultural dynamics that need to take place, which often aren't understood, or even, I'm trying to think of the right thing, when we're putting an agenda together or a program, it's certainly something you don't consider, is those dynamics that are likely to take place in the meantime, but we're always thinking that step ahead and saying, no, well, we've got all these different scenarios in place that if this happens, I can do that, or I can pull somebody else in, and there are always people that we can actually call on to fill in the gap. And sorry, I'm sort of talking about a range of things, from some very aggressive attitudes to people not even turning up. So, what do you do in those situations? Is that, as an Aboriginal person, we've got the ability of jumping straight in instead of, possibly being flustered and saying, what do I do now? Please help me. So just, no, this is what we're going to do. We've already got that scenario already figured out. There's this person I've just seen walking through the crowd. I'm going to go and tap them on the shoulder and say, come with me. And my excuse is to them is, you've got a cultural responsibility, come with me. so often people don't have a choice.
And just recently, we've both sat on some selection panels just recently, and I think out of probably 12 people in the room, there was probably 3 Aboriginal people on those projects, and I think that just shows you the difference between Indigenous-led project and a non-Indigenous-led project, and the importance of having Aboriginal voices at the table. And even the final decision in the artworks itself, there was, I had a chat with Uncle Barry about it, and he was like, there was a beautiful cultural aspect to an art piece, but the Aboriginal people saw it, but none of the non-Aboriginal people saw it. And to me, that was really, that highlighted the significance of having Aboriginal voices in the room, and just that understanding behind cultural aspects to artworks itself.
Yeah, and it can probably be the thing that can be quite insulting, confronting, offensive, when I guess non-Aboriginal people have that conversation with us. They listen to the significance and the ongoing values that a location, people or country has to us, especially very specific locations, and then interpret our cultural information or our cultural knowledge into a creative that almost has nothing to do with the significance and the values associated to locations. I can see Sandra's laughing away, she knows what I mean. But it's quite offensive, and then we often don't get met with or consulted with until the art piece has actually been through a process and been selected, and then we get to see it installed and think, that's not what we said. That doesn't reflect the significance or the ongoing values of this location. And I think the story that you're referring to, that that Uncle Barry Maguire brought up was about on the Esplanade to do with two brothers. And it's an ongoing storyline with that, and because we've just sat on a panel that he's referring to, was making decisions or evaluating a very large landmark art piece that I think Tom was also involved in, so you'll know which one I'm talking about. But the process going through that and looking at the way people interpret collaboration, sitting on a panel, and I've sat on a lot of art panels, evaluating the submissions that get sent through, and probably the collaboration approach has really been reiterated, I guess, over the last 3 years, and I'm seeing changes into how artists consider what that word collaboration means. But even still today, I see artists collaborating with elders who, albeit hold cultural knowledge, do not have the capacity or the capabilities of engaging in the meaningful way within developing up the creative for that art project. So realistically, they're just sitting there as a consultant. That's quite offensive. So if you're looking at a collaborative approach, and we've got a lot of Aboriginal artists that are very experienced at working in the public realm and with 3D pieces as well, with numerous materials. So there's no real reason, and if people are getting stuck about how do we adequately engage in that collaborative approach, come and talk to us, because we've had quite a number of experiences now in what that means and how Aboriginal people want to be engaged in a collaborative approach. A collaborative approach doesn't mean 20-80. It doesn't mean 30 to the Aboriginal party and then 70 to a non-Indigenous person because they might be administrating or managing and developing up more of the creative designs around the plans and the actual drawings. That's not what that means. It means 50-50. So how do you work collaboratively with Aboriginal people in any kind of art process or art project? And I think that's something that probably still needs to have a little bit of a robust conversation about what that means and how is it done. And look, I've seen this very clearly, even sitting on a couple of panels where we pulled up one party who were actually successful in winning, and the non-Aboriginal person said, oh yes, but I seen it advertised. So I put in the expression of interest. I wrote up all the background information and the scheduling to go with it. And then I went and approached the Aboriginal artist. So the Aboriginal artist then said to us, oh no, they came and seen me and asked me if I wanted to be involved. So as far as I was concerned, the other person had done the right thing. But in the whole scheme of things, when we're sitting on the evaluation panel and we're seeing how the work's actually unfolded, there wasn't a collaborative approach at all. So it's just, if you don't know, come and talk to us, because we've seen it over and over again, and actually we want this area of arts, the arts industry, to really improve the way forward, I guess, especially for burgeoning artists. And like, Aboriginal burgeoning artists are like any young artist. They're just so eager to be involved. They'll take the scraps off the table just to have some of their creative included in a finished product. So, I think you'll probably understand that from your earlier days in arts.
Yeah, with the topic you were specifically talking about, particularly in the public art, when we have Aboriginal art projects, and they're almost forcing collaborations within that space. And whenever there's a big tender come out, I get phone calls from a lot of different, artistic teams, and I refer to it as a scavenger hunt, where all the teams are out there trying to find an Aboriginal artist to pair up with to tender for this project. And it's not Indigenous-led, these collaborations. There's no relationship formed. I don't know these people. I've never met them, and I'm just getting phone calls out of the blue. And to me, I didn't feel comfortable working with them because I didn't have a relationship with them. And it is frustrating to see that. And I recently went in with one with Tom, and I approached Tom, and I said to him, how do you feel about being my token white guy, in this project? And I did that because me and Tom have a relationship, and we know each other, and I trust him. But it's not the case for a lot of these projects that, you know, they're finding very inexperienced Aboriginal artists and they're taking them for a ride on these projects. Instead of, you know, in mentorships and building them up, they're literally just taking the artwork and running, and then they're taking all the money too. So that's the importance of Indigenous-led projects, and how do we mentor Aboriginal artists to get to the point where they can form their own teams and have autonomy over the actual project they're going for. And that's what's so important. And one thing that we really wanted to mentor and try and help Alona through this process as well, and I think she's gained a lot of experience in that space as well, which I think we've done a really good job with.
Oh, absolutely. She was so nervous, but she was more nervous about upsetting other Aboriginal people. So even counselling and coaching her and mentoring her through that as well, and just say, no, you know, we got your back. You're actually doing what you've been instructed to do, and we've advised that we actually want you involved in this project. So we will deal with anything else, and if you've got some issues, do not hesitate in getting on the phone to us or asking us to come and meet you for a cuppa, and just speak really openly, because Alona, like a lot of young artists, are very, very nervous about what the community, our own community, will do or say to young Aboriginal artists, because they're so frightened about getting or interpreting that information, our own information, wrong in their art preparation, especially when we've got a young Aboriginal artist who may be from a couple of different Aboriginal bloodlines. And I'm talking about even my niece, who's, you know, she's Wodjuk, her mother's Wodjuk, but her father's Arunta, so from the Northern Territory. And she's got the blessing on from both families, both sides, to be able to present or to paint the Arunta way. But then she also needs to acknowledge that there is a Wodjuk way of presenting art from the southwest, and in some pieces she actually combines them both, but she actually asks us for permission. So I think, you know, for what we've been around for a little while, we've also got to provide that additional support to our own young artists coming up, so to take away that nervousness and that worry about, they're not even worried once they present a piece what the rest of the community think. That's the least of their concern. Otherwise they're nervous when they stand up in front of the mail, like Alona was the other night when she was speaking. I've never seen her so so shaky, but it's all new, and they're new life experiences as well, which they haven't been prepared for, so it's up to us to actually do that. So as much as, you know, we sort of ask you to really think about your approach when you're engaging within the arts industry with Aboriginal people, regardless of their age, it's also considering the role that other Aboriginal people, experienced people, have in mentoring and monitoring and then facilitating or even co-facilitating that process.
And I think just before we go to questions, I just want to acknowledge how awesome Alona's been through this entire process, and she's just hit everything out of the park and has been so professional in how she's done everything, and it is quite, I can't believe how mature she's been, really, for such a young artist to create this project.
Thanks, Ron and Karen. Do we have any questions from the audience relating to Mumbakai and the process or the outcomes or the way that the audience might have reacted to the work? Anyone got some thoughts?
Gee, we must be good.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I know very little about art and unfortunately not much about Noongar culture. I'm the son of Polish immigrants who arrived just out the road there 70 years ago. So, but as a white person who lived in Collie for a long time, some of you may know where it is, I'm just amazed by this Biennale, because as a white kid in the 60s, I didn't know anything about your culture. I didn't know anything about what we should properly call where I was walking and in fact where I live now. So my comment is to the overall Biennale people, This has been fantastic. I think it's revelatory and it should be applauded, and I hope it continues into other biennales. And the fact that we can, as white guys, we can try and learn more about the origins of these stories and the hope that these stories continue to educate us. It's just fantastic. So that's my only comment. It's not a question, but I just congratulate you all, and it's been a fantastic experience. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful. I did, just to help energise some questions, I did want to ask Karen and Rowan about the importance of ceremony to this work. Whilst, the audiences have enjoyed the high impact and the high technology from the shorelines of the sites and their landscapes, there's been a lot of ceremony in the back room before, during and after the work, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you've orchestrated and looked after and maintained a very artful process in itself of that ceremony.
Well, I guess at the heart of things, we're very much a spiritual people. So when we say we're Aboriginal led, we're actually led by our spirit more than anything else. And the land to us, regardless of where we are and what's constructed on it, still contains the spirit of our ancestors and what was the practice in that location as well. So if there are ceremonies, whether it's been men's law ceremonies or women's ceremonies and birthing ceremonies, the spirit of what occurred there still sits in that place. So whenever we're looking at new projects, and regardless of what they are, and especially, the arts industry has a very emotional tug at people's psyche and their hearts. So when we're talking about spirit, there's then that direct connection. So when we're talking to someone's heart, their spirit and their head, then we need to make sure that the spirits in that land are at peace as well, and actually permit us to pass on knowledge, because what we're doing is transferring our intellectual knowledge and building capacity amongst the general community who actually have no knowledge about our culture and our cultural practices. So we need to, in one way, for us to open up the spirit of the land, open up the hearts and the spirit and the heads of the people that are going to be engaged in that project, we need to make sure that we take on ceremony in preparation for that. And of course, at the beginning of all the drone shows, we've had a smoking ceremony. And part of that smoking ceremony is to do away with the warrawirran, so the bad spirits. And everybody, we have the yin and yang. If you're into yin and yang, we've got the yin and yang in us. And when we come into a place, we need to make sure that that bad spirit or the negative forces within us actually aren't there. So we stop them in their tracks by actually delivering the smoking ceremony. The smoke is a cleansing process. So what that's doing, it's shooing. It's saying, bad spirit, you're actually not welcome here. And it's bringing in the good spirit so that we're opening. You can see while I'm saying that, we're opening your heart. We're opening your spirit. We're opening your head to taking on a new way of being educated or receiving the knowledge that you're about to either see or hear. So ceremony is really important in preparing people for our cultural integrity, our cultural values, and what is significant to us. And again, we are a spiritual people. Is there anything you want to say?
You know that. Yeah. Hit that out of the park. Any other questions? Yes, we've got one here behind you, Tom. Thank you.
Hi. I just wondered whether we could talk a little bit about the technical side of that work and how that was negotiated within the process.
Yeah, thank you.
Wrong people to be asking that one too. You want to talk to that, Tom? You're right there.
Expand on that question, please.
I guess, technology is, for me, I guess, looking at these stories and this work, it's so connected to country and connected to place, and then to weave the technology in that. I guess I'm interested in how those conversations were had, because in some ways it's another language.
Yeah, so I guess first I wanted to express my gratitude to Karen and Rowan and the whole team for enabling us to actually explore a project of this magnitude. And in response to your question, actually the solution to utilizing drone technology came out of a problem. We were faced with the two bridges, the waterways, and couldn't really engage with either of these built assets. So that space in between became an opportunity for us to engage with a creative endeavor. And continuing in our tradition of light and using, cutting edge technology with sustainable messaging, connecting to place, and the polarizing ancient stories with really cutting edge technology became an interesting point of conversation and tension in the artwork. And it was that sort of proposition that we started exploring what actually could the content be driving, basically. So that's what it is. And it's also a greater conversation around fireworks and the whole notion of spectacle, like these big expensive fireworks which don't tell anything really. It's just celebrating capitalism. And I think to bring a bit more meaningful connection to sites, this work really strives to do that in its best of ways.
I might add just a little thought from Alona, which is public now. I mean, if you may have all read the interview in The Australian yesterday in the review. But Alona does talk about the spirit of the drones and just how that's an essential part of the narrative. And there's been a really interesting discussion. Kat might talk about these, 160, children in the air, or elders or adults, but people trying to tell the story. There's 160 of them. They're all individuals. And for a moment there, I really loved how a couple of them were scallywags. The first one, they went off and they had a little bit of a misplay around the back, and that's that tells about stories about family and community and protocol and behaviour as well. So, but has there anyone read that article in the review? It's quite I encourage you to. Another question?
I'm not really quite sure how to articulate it, and you've sort of been answering it as you've been talking anyway, but it's sort of partly a comment, I guess, which is just like the tension between, which is sort of what the work provokes, I think, the question to ask in a lot of ways, is the tension between that technology and the story, and that technology, drone technology, that like in the sort of commodity supply chain, at the one end of it is resources that have been sort of mined, and then factories that have built certain things, and there's all these kind of like stories that they carry in with that, which may be environmentally destructive or have some kind of, there may be sort of slavery in some of the factories that we just don't know, and it's just like an unknown presence in the sort of commodity supply chain that ends up being used to tell that story. And I just find that like a really interesting tension, and I just wanted to get your guys' responses to the sort of emotional aspect of that process. Especially with these stories being told, which are not just, they're not entertainment, they're stories that carry really important messages about, about country and ways to live. So I just find that really interesting, that tension.
Anyone want to talk to that?
That's, pretty deep thoughts into the technology side of things, and I didn't really think of that much, to tell you the truth. But like I said, when you look at like Aboriginal culture and what it's all about, questions are raised about technology, and is it ethical in to our culture to use technology that does damage the earth, and that's a big discussion to have, which I don't think we have enough time to even go into today. But even around the funding behind it as well, like who puts the money in, where it all comes from. There's so many questions to be raised, but if none of those happened, we wouldn't have a show like this, and our story wouldn't be told in such a magnificent way. So it's sort of, which way do you go? Do you not have anything, or do you, have to, swallow your pride a little bit and adapt to that? So.
But also, if I may add, Rowan, it's a good question, Jack, because one of our funding conditions was to really unpack and examine what the ethical elements are behind the fabrication, manufacturing of the drone. So we did go to some extensive research to make sure that as far as we could go back, it was ethically done. away from slavery, and we kind of inspected all that, but we couldn't go all the way back to the origin. Surely there would have been some disputed notions along the way, but we definitely looked into that. Yeah.
We have to all be constantly pretty comfortable with these kind of paradoxes in this world that we live in. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really good question too, and Karen and Ryan might like to talk about the future of this project as it leaves Noongar country and heads north. You know, I mean, there's some really good questions, you know, as it enters the resource sector, as it enters landscapes full of technology, you know, what the narratives around there, but most importantly, respectful to the empowerment of the communities who will be the new authors of the work. But yeah, we've still got time.
But that is a very big ethical question.
Yeah.
And again, we could probably spend a day talking about that, because if we break it down, there are so many different dilemmas within developing a product that gets used in a broad scale educational approach, so that we're targeting as many people from the community in providing that cultural education. And there's lots, if I look at all of the, I guess, the exhibits that have been on over the last week, if we go over the different kinds of materials, they're all coming from the ground in one form or another. So when we talk about, you know, the ethics involved in any public representation, there's a really difficult line, and I think that's probably another workshop other than today. But it is a question that probably is worthwhile presenting, even back to Aboriginal people. You know, how do we feel about using the natural resource industry in ways that are developing up the products where we're actually presenting our dreaming stories back to the community? It's that's quite an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, on that note, the difficult note, there's a challenge for us. I'd like to say thanks so much to Karen and Ryan for this talk, and can we put our hands together? Thanks so much. Thanks, Karen. Now, our final session is, we're going to welcome Sandra back to the front, and Rowan and Sandra are going to have an all-encompassing discussion, I think. This is a great opportunity for the conversations to come to a closing. It's been a pretty formidable 2 days. There is a lot of discussion, I think, that's got to be had now. Many, many good questions, and some great, frank feedback from the audience and from the speakers. So particularly I'd like to thank Karen today. Karen's an enormous leader of Perth, Whadjuk country. She goes beyond extremes to heal this country, to be generous across many platforms. I don't know how you fit it in. We're always conscious that you're travelling from Mandurah. I know the meetings, we always try to accommodate travel time in there, but there's so much more to accommodate with your life, Karen, because it's exhausting, and but we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Cheers. Yeah. Well, you carry an enormous load. But anyway, over to you guys.
Yeah, so this year's Biennale was me and Sandra had quite a part in this one, and you know, sitting in with all the cultural conversations, and Sandra was taking the cultural lead, and I was there more for a Noongar artist perspective from a younger generation, and the two perspectives we came from were quite different in the discussions, which I thought was really cool to see. And as well as being part of those discussions, we've also been collaborating in different projects, and I've been collaborating with Jessie Lee Johns on the Commonwealth of New Bayswater, and Sandra's collaborated on about 5 projects, and she's been on almost everything.
Yes, I almost feel embarrassed, yes. Really a little bit of background about how I got involved, and I'm not too sure. I sort of blame Karen for this, but then maybe she wasn't all of the reason. But anyway, regardless of that, I was contacted by Tom if I would participate in a forum with a whole lot of people there in Fremantle, and I think that's how it did come about, because Karen unfortunately couldn't make it, and as a result from that workshop and doing a Welcome to Country, it sort of it just got out of control for the last 12 months. So I got involved really not because, I went seeking it. But I always say, like, as a Noongar, if I get involved in anything, or if I say something, it's usually because the Noongar, my Noongar spirits are guiding me to something that I should be involved in. And I think that looking back now, I can see why, from a cultural perspective, I think why I did become involved in the whole Biennale project. And as Rowan said, what I thought was just being part of the process and being part of the advisory to the artists and bringing the cultural sort of content to Walyulup and the Biennale. One of the artists asked me if I would work with them, and I said yes. And then another artist asked me if I would be involved, and of course I said yes. And then Catherine, I think, asked me if I would do some workshops with the school, so I said yes. And so, I was saying yes at all these different times, not realising that these were all little projects. And of course, jazz, then I was asked. So, yeah, I think I ended up what was just supposed to be a Welcome to Country and a discussion forum. It turned out to be working on several projects. And I do feel embarrassed. But, sorry, before I hand over to Rowan, I was looking at the gorgeous, I don't know what you call it, but this work that Reese has done, and it said on here that there should be more Aboriginal people involved. And yes, I absolutely agree that there really, if I did 5, there should have been 4 other Noongar people involved. But it was just the way the whole process evolved, and the next thing I knew, I was sort of I felt obligated.
I think we need to rename it the Biennale of Sandra, really.
Yeah, thanks. You're embarrassing me even more.
But listening yesterday to Clothilde Bullen, and she was talking about collaborations and relationships, and saying we need to look at it more as a relationship than a collaboration. And I thought that was really strong. And looking back at my collaboration with Jesse, Tom just said, I've got a guy I want to introduce you to, with no expectations. And when he introduced me to Jesse, we just sort of hit it off, and I absolutely loved his concept. And he asked me to create artwork for the museum. And I said, oh, leave it with me for a few days and I'll get back to you. And I sort of come up with the concept of an inverted history and telling that story from how I viewed our Aboriginal history, and being able to show it in a way that non-Aboriginal people can feel the same way that I felt looking at those images. And when I presented that concept to Jesse, he really loved it, and then he went away and come back with an inverted museum to show the inverted history. And that collaboration, after hearing what Clothilde said, it didn't feel like a collaboration with Jesse, it just felt like I was doing a project with a mate. And that's the sort of relationships I think that Clothilde was sort of trying to get at when it comes to collaboration, and it's forming that relationship, forming trust, and actually getting to know each other properly so you can actually work together in a way that is ethical. And I thought that was really a strong point that Clothilde brought out, and something I saw personally within working on this project with Jesse. And that was really a really cool point that Clothilde brought out, and something that I'll think about for the rest of my life, really, when it comes to collaborations and building those relationships.
Makes me think about the project that I did for the Gathering Place with Shane and Drew. And it was just as a result of, after them presenting, the sort of work that they were thinking about doing as part of the Biennale. And after our meeting, we had the opportunity to, have a drink and some nibbles, and so got talking to particularly to Shane, and again we just clicked. There was something, and my Wirran felt really good. So he said, "Hey, would you be interested in working with us?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, it'd be really, really good." And mind you, it took quite a few sessions about what we were going to do. And it even got to the point where it was getting closer and closer to what are we actually going to be doing for the project. And Shane and Drew both said, "Look, we got a really hard time from Tom and Grant. I don't think they really liked what we were thinking about." And I said, "Really?" I said, oh gosh, then that sort of like reflects on me as well, because for some reason I wasn't at that meeting. So when they came back and said that, I said, "Oh my goodness, like, really?" So all these ideas and conversations that we'd had over these months and months, well, all the ideas were sort of like thrown out the window. And it was only until, and I think I said to you, I always believe that the weir in my Noongar spirit is guiding me. So of course when we got to that point and said, well, what do we do? Do we throw all our ideas, everything out the window, which was a smoking ceremony, a welcome to country with audio sound and incorporating all the natural sort of elements in the space? Well, that all went out the window. And we were even going to get grass trees and make it look sort of really like Noongar country, without all the cement and that. But anyway, suffice to say, at some point we were asked if we would do a love letter to land. And we said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea." And that was actually the inspiration for the gathering place. And so with the love letter to land, it was all the things that Drew and Shane had captured and what I had observed. And I said, "Okay, I'll translate it into Noongar language." And hence that was the outcome of the project, which I think is just beautiful. But the point that I wanted to make was all the way along, even though we were starting to really worry that we weren't going to have a project to deliver, we didn't stress out. We just stayed calm. We worked together, and we had we had coffee and good conversations, and so it was a really, really good. It's a really good relationship, and I think what Rowan was saying, it's about building that relationship, building that trust and respecting each other, and just being really confident that at the end of it, we had the skills and the ability to deliver. And we did. And I must say that that gathering place has been used to actually create a project for the Perth Waldorf School. And it's just amazing. So I'm hoping that, we'll generate a few more projects from this. And I really believe, that this project should be permanent. It should be a place where everyone can go to and sit and reflect and think about the message that we're given in that gathering place, and that is, to sit and listen and learn, because, the Buja is wangin to Nunukut, the land is speaking to you. So I guess it's the equivalent of going to a place of meditation.
It's funny how you say that, when you love the idea of the love letter to place, and I really didn't. That was not something I was comfortable doing. And when I think Tom brought it to me, I was like, really? That's That's so not me. And I think even my wife said, you better not write a love letter to a place before you write one to me. My approach to that, I was really struggled with it, and I think I actually wrote it about 12 o'clock at night. I woke up in a bit of a, I was getting frustrated and annoyed, and I actually penned it down like a suicide note, and from place, and then another letter consoling place. So it was something that I was way out of my comfort zone, and I actually really like the idea now because it pushed me into a place where I didn't know I could go. And writing, I've never liked writing. Writing's not something I've ever really liked doing, or expressing feeling in writing either. And that was something that really changed my mind around that medium as well, and something I never thought I would ever write a poem or a letter or anything like that. So, and it just shows, I think, right through the whole conversations, it was great that I got to listen to different artists, talk about their projects, and I loved listening to different creative processes, and that was really interesting to me. And I always say that an Aboriginal, cultural background, the processes are a little bit different to a Western viewpoint when it comes to creating artwork. And to sit there and actually understand it more, it's broadened my artistic horizon and my approach to actually creativity. And when listening to some of the projects, you're like, oh, some of them I couldn't stand. And I actually said to Tom after, I was like, I really didn't like that. And Tom's like, oh, I loved it. And I was like, really? And then other ones where I come up and said, oh, I love that. And Tom's like, really? So it just shows you the differences in personalities when it comes to art and creativity and the processes. And that's one part that I absolutely really enjoyed. And after the first one, I was a bit sceptical. I was like, oh, I don't know if I like this, or I didn't know if I felt a little bit intimidated being in that space. But after a few, I started to really enjoy it. And this is something that I really appreciate. I'm appreciative of the Biennale for that opportunity to sit in those sessions and to listen to professional artists talk about their creative process. And it's something that I've drawn a lot from.
Yeah, I might just add very quickly, on the Shane and Drew story, working with Sandra, and this importance of slowing down and just letting things happen. But I have a studio, in Pakenham Street next to Shane and Drew, and I was particularly interested to feel for this difficulty in the everyday, and I could almost hear the books falling off the shelf in Shane and Drew's studio, design studio. The volumes were being discarded, and architecture and landscape architecture, they're precious disciplines. Not so much landscape architecture, but we're very, very conscious of how we're trying to indigenise architecture in Western Australia. And there are other leaders in Indigenous architecture elsewhere in Australia. And Chloe spoke of that yesterday, that she thinks that, the design of the built environment, we haven't quite explored that yet well enough. We haven't had the debate. But there was Drew and Shane dragging their feet in the studio. I could almost hear the whimpers, and then they'd come and bang on my door and, I just, like, they were small children. And it was beautiful. And I've seen it before, and, Ari's seen it in studios before in design schools around Australia, is where people need to get a bit lost. They need to sort of, remove these clothes that we wear. We need to remove those volumes from Western architectural schools because they are massive impediments in so many ways. But to Sandra's credit, and I think to Shane and Drew, when they became naked and withdrew from a lot of Western thinking, then the magic happened. And the tenacity, patience, resilience and so forth in that relationship was just quite remarkable to observe, and then obviously now see an outcome which I think needs to be now documented and shared with the rest of the world, especially Sandra's audio that goes with it, which I think is an important part of architecture, but others may not think that. Yeah. Now, opening up to the audience for questions. We've got a few more minutes to go. Does anyone like to ask Sandra and Rowan? Any brave questions out there? Yes, Ari. No, there's a microphone here. Tom, can you? Yeah, just to help with the live streamers.
Sure, is that okay? Just going back to a comment Sandra made about how she was across 5 projects when really she should have been probably on one with 4 other Indigenous consultants or collaborators involved or artists involved in those works. And it's something that I think I've spoken to you briefly about before, about how there is a lot of responsibility placed on seemingly a small number of people's shoulders to represent and present and educate non-Indigenous communities about First Nations culture. And I guess my question is more about how you see that that role being expanded to more people, and also how it can be opened up in a way that is respectful, but also, I guess, curated isn't the right word, but, you know, respecting all the different parties involved in that sharing of knowledge.
Well, for me, you know, as a Noongar, it's always important for us to, you know, make sure that we all share the work, because I think, as Karen pointed out earlier, you know, we all come with different cultural knowledge and stories because we come from different parts of country and so on. And I think that, you know, this Fremantle Biennale was the first of it looking through an Indigenous lens, an Aboriginal lens. And so I think that we will take lessons away from this in terms of, you know, how it all transpired. But certainly, you know, what I would suggest is that, you know, for the 2023 Biennale, leading up to that, that we tap into the local networks. So, for example, you know, the Walyallup Aboriginal Elders Advisory Committee and so on, to promote the Biennale and to then put out, I guess, you know, and ask who would like to be involved, you know, in the Biennale. And so that way we'll get more of a spread. But I think that just the way things happened, it was by just meeting different people and me always saying yes, yes, yes. I did try to bring some other people in, and I think I did to an extent bring at least another 1 or 2 in. And yeah, I did actually. But in terms of you know, maybe interpreting the stories, someone else can bring something else different. But yeah, so we've certainly learnt from that. But yeah, it's a great experience though. And what Rowan was saying, that you know, the Fremantle Biennale for me has enabled me, or allowed me, to say yes, I am creative. And I've heard so many people say to me, but you are creative, Sandra, you know, you've done this, this and that. And I kept saying, but I'm not creative, I'm not artistic, I'm you know, have sort of knowledge and language. And they're saying, but that's what being artistic is, that's what being creative is. And so I've acknowledging, yes, that I'm an artist for the first time. Thank you.
Any final thoughts? Can't believe it. We've got 1 minute to go. Timing's impeccable.
We also have Reese, Grant.
Yeah, Reese. Yeah, maybe we'll go straight to Reese to wrap up. Thanks, Reese. Excuse me. Thanks, Tom.
Wonderful. How should I do this? Should I come over here now?
Yeah.
So I guess, thanks everyone for today. Yeah, it goes really quickly. Again, so we're just looking at yesterday's Scribe. This was still I'm still going to be finalising this, and I did share this with you in the morning. But again, I guess the main themes here being it's similar to the themes that we've been talking about today. I guess it's Chad in his talk this morning really sort of summarised the primary theme, I suppose, of the conversations that were being had, which is walking in those two worlds, the Aboriginal concepts and cultural ideas, and how that sort of reflects and relates to the modern. So I mean, you've already seen that. I'm sort of happy to talk about today's one. And again, today's one, I'm still going to be fixing that up. So could we maybe just chuck on the next one? I just had to run up there in the last 10 minutes and like airdrop what I got, but I've sort of actually filled out a lot of that space with a lot of what you guys were saying just before there, Annie. But essentially on the left here side, I sort of go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So today, especially what I was saying with Chad, talking about those two worlds, and this is such a common theme that we talk about in educating when it comes to Aboriginal culture, non-Aboriginal culture. He's talking about considering the cultural protocols, and he mentioned there was 10, but he did say specifically he was talking about those two being of self-determination and respect. And we have Jazz as well, talking about the significance of the waterways, and I really think that the summary of what that conversation was about was really like the language and how Budja or country receives and understands language from the different languages. In this case, how to navigate the translating and respecting, in her case, the Wiradjuri to the Noongar to the English, and I guess the politics around that. And she had a nice little quote there, chucked down the bottom, which was, without the language, we lose connection, which is true. We have with our next speakers there with Karen and Rowan, talking about I guess again sort of the conversations and the politics around the cultural knowledge, the artists themselves, and I think there was a really interesting conversation that was being had around like what do the elders want to be reflected, and then like what the artists want to portray. And I guess I think this personally for me, I find that any time an artist wants to do something, the more people that you get involved with that idea, the less likely it's going to happen, or like the less likely you're going to get to the outcome. And I think in this context, it's really important because you're dealing with cultural context and cultural cartage and knowledge, cultural understandings, cultural approaches, that it's like, okay, well, politically, you've got to go ask the elders, right? So I think there's a really strong conversation to be had about how do we have those conversations. I really like that. But I like Karen's approach there, just about like if you wanted to be involved in collaborative approach, just come and ask us, come and talk to us, come have a yarn with us. And I think there's some dot points over there about considering the storytelling and the men and women's business and confidence and sharing. And there's a little story there about Joondalup and how there was, again, you're seeing those sort of two worlds overlap, right, with the concept of what the modern understands as Joondalup in this case, and what the traditional is Joondalup being that woman with the stars, right? And then I was sort of playing with the owner up the top there. Unfortunately, Sister wasn't able to come and speak with us directly today, so I've kind of left a little bit of space there, which I'll go back and finalise afterwards, just to sort of summarise, like I guess her approaches and how she fit into this space with the amazing project that she did. And that's it. Auntie Sandra taught me some new words today. Yarn call, Kobirak and come along, beautiful spirit, Kundan, being respect. So yeah, that's I guess a bit of a summary of what I did today.
Beautiful, Reese. Tom, did you want to say any final words? But
journey we've been on, and I think we always encourage our audiences to become active participants, and that's been really key to how we can create and affect change together. So thank you for coming part of this journey with us, and Thank you, Grant, for holding the space. Sandra, Karen and Rowan. That's it.